Well, good evening, everyone. Last time we met here on this very stage to talk about the story of the Civil War at sea and on the rivers. Jim, you were putting the finishing touches on your new book. Craig, you were preparing your book for publication as well. And now I have to do this the way they do on the talk shows. So now, James McPherson's War on the Waters, the Union and Confederate Navies, 1861 to 1865, and Craig L. Symonds' The Civil War at Sea, both very handsomely done, are both out. And it's good because we get to resume our conversation. We barely scratched the surface or broke the surface. I have to remember to use nautical terms here. Let's get right to it, because we spoke for an hour last time, and we got to about January of 1862. So I will assume you all know about 1861 and get to something that Jim pointed out in his book, which I found rather interesting, and that is that 150 years ago this month, aside from all the other things that were going on, including the first shudders of a realization that Lincoln had actually promulgated an Emancipation Proclamation, the blockade was in force in Confederate ports. The Union had commenced a bombardment of the city of Vicksburg. New Orleans had fallen. The Tennessee, Cumberland, and Mississippi rivers seemed to belong to the North, not the South. And it must have seemed for a time in 1862 that this combination of events, particularly the naval successes for the Union, were about to end the war between the states. And then the trend line changed. The father of waters that Lincoln boasted now flowed unvexed to the sea became vexed all over again. So Jim, let's start with you. What happened and why?
Well, the Union Navy was on a roll in the fall and winter of 61 and 62 and in the spring of 1862. And it looked like they were going to open up the Mississippi River completely in the summer of 1862. Vicksburg was really the only Confederate bastion still on the Mississippi River, and both the seagoing fleet under now Admiral David Glasgow Farragut came all the way up from the Gulf of Mexico to Vicksburg, and the so-called Western Flotilla of river gunboats, some of them ironclads, had fought its way down the Mississippi, capturing Memphis on the way, a number of other places as well, and they combined to bombard Vicksburg, but it was clear that the city could not be, and the batteries there could not be taken without the support of Army troops. And General Halleck, who was the Army commander in that theater, I like to call him General Can't Be Done, told Farragut, who asked if he could spare some of his 100,000 troops that had just captured Corinth to help Corinth, Mississippi, a railroad junction, to capture Vicksburg. And Halleck said, can't be done. Don't have enough troops. And the level of the river was dropping so much. The Union naval forces and the Army troops that were there, only 3,000 of them were all getting sick. Some of them were dying from sickness. So the Union forces actually gave up the effort to capture Vicksburg in the summer of 1862 because the Navy alone couldn't do it, which came as something of a surprise to the Northern public, because up until that time, the Navy had been doing a lot of things all by itself without any Army support. They had captured the Hatteras Inlet forts in August of 1861. They'd captured Port Royal Bay in November of 1861, and most spectacularly of all, of course, Farragut's fleet had captured New Orleans, all without any Army support at all. But clearly, that run of success was going to come to an end. The Confederates had now figured out some ways to carry the war to the Union forces itself. They had built an ironclad named the Arkansas up the Yazoo River in Mississippi, and it came down all by itself and attacked the Union fleet in July of 1862. The Confederates had gotten two commerce raiders, the Florida and the Alabama, built in Britain, and they were being loosed on the seas now in the summer and fall of 1862. The Union Navy had captured Galveston in October 1862, but the Confederates counterattacked on New Year's Day and drove them out. So the momentum of the war had seemed to be reversed. And it took a while before it would swing back in the Union favor again.
Craig, Jim mentioned Halleck's reluctance to involve himself. Walk us through the development of the understanding of the urgent need for joint operations around this period.
Well, I was just going to say that the broader question behind all of this is the fact that there was no protocol, no understanding, and very little experience in the history of the United States that would allow the Navy and the Army to work as partners of a single team. We have to remember that, of course, the National Security Act of 1947 is a post-World War II phenomenon that created, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense. During the Civil War, and in fact during World War II, there was a Secretary of War who was responsible for the Army and a Secretary of the Navy, obviously responsible for the Navy, who sat as co-equals at the cabinet table, and they were members of a coalition, perhaps. They were on the same side, without a doubt, but they were hardly partners. And that became very clear early on. Not only was Halleck, general can't be done, jealous of his own command for Corinth. He wanted to keep the forces under his own immediate control, which he believed was essential to capture this railroad hub. But in addition, the Navy was equally jealous of partnering with the Army. They didn't want to do it. Secretary Wells, Gideon Wells, Secretary of the Navy, was absolutely determined whenever possible that the Navy should do things without helping the Army. It wasn't just that they could do it without the Army. They really sought to do it without the Army, and that was a good thing because then they got the headline. So behind all of this difficulty that begins to emerge now, late in '62, there is this sort of underpinning of jealousy, competition, rivalry between the Union Army and the Union Navy.
Who outranks whom when they meet? Does a captain of the Navy outrank a captain of the Army?
Well, in that particular case, yes. But again, taken most broadly, and let me make a couple of points. One is that the Army had lots of generals, and the Navy had no admirals. Now, the Navy's going to get some. He's coming. Farragut will be the first. But early on in American history, there was a notion that while armies were there to defend home and hearth and protect the Constitution, navies were kind of instruments of empire. It was the Royal Navy that would come over here and blockade our shores and take our sailors. So navies were to be looked at with some suspicion. And in particular, fleets of ships, ships of the line, of which we had very few, and no admirals at all. So the highest rank you could have in the United States Navy was Navy captain. Now, there was an honorary title of Commodore that went to whoever was the senior captain in a group of captains cooperating together. But the highest rank was that of captain, and the equivalency is that with an Army colonel. So in theory, an Army colonel and a Navy captain, this is still true today, were co-equal in position. But that division between Army and Navy meant they couldn't give orders to each other. I often told my students when I was teaching at the Naval Academy, do you realize that during the Civil War, the highest ranking general in the Army could not give an order to a seaman recruit? And they said, well, sir, that's the way it ought to be. That's exactly right. So, but it was a problem whenever you're trying to coordinate activities. So who's in charge? Nobody's in charge.
The commander-in-chief, ultimately.
The commander-in-chief is in charge, but he's 1,000 miles away in Washington, D.C.
But it could work when the Army commander and the naval commander of a particular operation cooperated with each other, and that became spectacularly true with Captain Andrew Hull Foote, commander of the Western Flotilla, and Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant in the winter of 1862, because they worked together to capture Forts Henry, Fort Donelson, and on the tributaries of the Mississippi River. Then Foote was on his own for a while, working with John Pope, and that worked out pretty well too. When they captured Island Number 10 in April of 1862, part of this sequence of Union successes in the spring of 1862, which then did come to an end. So if there is informal cooperation between the two, then it works pretty well. But if they see themselves as rivals, then it's not going to work.
Right. And of course, they could see themselves as rivals within the Army service.